Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about challenges against the state's gun and magazine ban continuing in the courts, and Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson's actions impacting non-citizen arrivals to the Windy City. I'll then join the Center Square's Brett Rowland to further discuss those stories and more. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Are you tired of news that puts politics over people? At the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation, we believe in putting people over politics by delivering nonpartisan news and audio content that serves you, the American taxpayer. With Franklin News Foundation, you can read fact-based, state-focused news for free at thecentersquare.com. You can listen to civil, balanced conversations between policy experts through our podcast network at americastalking.com. Or you can get in-depth news on K-12 education spending, curriculum, and school safety at chalkboardnews.com. It's all free through Franklin, where we put you, the American taxpayer, first in every story, episode, and conversation. And it's only possible through our supporters. Together, we can produce content that puts people over politics and brings Americans the news they deserve. Become a supporter today at franklinnews.org/donate. Once again, that's franklinnews.org/donate.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Here's some of the top stories from the past week. Mayor Brandon Johnson's looking to slow the influx of migrants into the city of Chicago by impounding incoming buses that do not receive a permit from the Chicago Department of Transportation and by looking throughout the state for places to redirect the arrivals. Andrew Hensel has that story.
Around 24,000 migrants have arrived in Chicago from the southern U.S. border in the past 16 months, leading elected officials, including Johnson, to criticize border communities sending buses to sanctuary cities. However, Johnson is now looking to do something similar to what border communities are doing.
I don't know if there's any other administration that is working as hard as the people in this administration. Literally searching for property all over the state of Illinois because this is a crisis.
Alderman Chris Taliaferro says his constituents are looking to end the city's sanctuary status and put an end to the influx.
My constituents are very much concerned about whether or not we remain a sanctuary city and having that opportunity put before them on the ballot. But unfortunately, because of today's city council meeting, special city council meeting, that is not going to happen.
Border communities have sent migrants to Chicago, New York, and Washington, D.C., among other places. I'm Andrew Hensel.
Despite rules for Illinois' gun ban registry not being finalized and continued litigation in federal court, the deadline for Illinoisans to tell Illinois State Police they owned a banned firearm remains in effect for January 1st. The U.S. Supreme Court Thursday denied an emergency motion to block the law while the case plays out. Plaintiffs' groups are expected to bring a full appeal after an appeals court denied a full court hearing earlier this week. Separately, a ruling on a preliminary injunction against the deadline still pending in district court. The judge there said he'll file a ruling promptly, but said he's inclined to not block the deadline, insisting the litigants tackle the merits of the case sooner than later. With the rules not yet finalized and the merits of whether the law is constitutional not fully hashed out, Governor J.B. Pritzker Thursday said people know what they have to register.
And nobody is getting, charged, arrested. As you know, the first commission of a violation is a misdemeanor if it even gets charged. The second violation, however, is a felony.
Pritzker said the reason for the registry is because the state needs to know where such firearms are, quote, when and if a crime's committed with one. Those are the top stories from the past week from Illinois. Find more online at thecentersquare.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square's Brett Rowland to further discuss the news. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation is bringing you straight news journalism through the Center Square, reporting on state authorities and publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. By supporting the Center Square, you can track politicians' use of taxpayer money and demand transparency from elected officials. This is how we can equip everyday Americans to hold their government accountable. Become a supporter of Franklin today at franklinnews.org/donate.
Greetings and welcome to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Brett Rowland, investigative reporter for the Center Square, filling in for executive editor Dan McCaleb, who is traveling this week. Joining me today is Greg Bishop, associate Illinois editor and senior Capitol Bureau reporter.
You know, it's definitely the holiday season. I've been watching Elf and Home Alone on repeat.
We are definitely in holiday mode over here, and there's been no shortage of news this week, Greg. Let's jump into it. We've got about a million stories to talk about. The first one, though, I wanted to touch base on is the legislators who were thinking about using migrants for military and police service. What's the latest that's happened on that?
So the issue of the non-citizens in Illinois has been taking a lot of headlines, not just because of the humanitarian issues, but also the taxpayer costs, which are stacking up. Chicago has spent tens of millions of dollars. Governor J.B. Pritzker this week reiterated that the state's taxpayers have spent more than $500 million. We got to see the funds being spent on food, on housing, on healthcare. And even this week, there's been a lot of discussion about the buses of non-citizens coming from the southern border, heading to places like Chicago and other so-called sanctuary cities. And even Chicago this week impounded its first bus after Rosemont impounded a bus. And it seems that the sea is shifting a little bit in the sentiment on whether the city, as a sanctuary city, has the resources to take on that growing issue with more than 24,000 that have come to Illinois alone. And you've got 2+ million who've come across just in the past 12 to 16 months or so, or 18 months or so in the United States who have come across the southern U.S. border. So clearly this has been a hot button issue on the humanitarian front, but also on the taxpayer cost, with people clamoring for all kinds of solutions, ranging from more taxpayer dollars from the federal government to even those saying that the border needs to be shut down. But in all of that conversation, there's also been some interesting things that have been raised, including a measure from U.S. Senator Tammy Duckworth, who has filed a bill that would ultimately allow for members of the U.S. military to join, to be non-citizens. So you would have non-citizens join the military after a vetting process, and if they are in the military and serve their time, it could be a pathway towards citizenship. So Duckworth has this Senate Resolution 2401. It's known as the Enlist Act, and it was actually introduced way back on July 19th, and it remains in a U.S. Senate committee of the judiciary. There have been similar measures filed in the U.S. House in previous years, but this one coming from Illinois U.S. Senator Tammy Duckworth, again, filed over the summer. It would allow for undocumented individuals in the country who pass a physical and other required background checks. Then they could serve in the military, and if they do so honorably, they could then get a pathway towards citizenship in the United States. And this has support also from Illinois U.S. Senator Dick Durbin. But again, this measure remains in a U.S. Senate committee. So while we're looking at all of the humanitarian issues of non-citizens being bused from the southern U.S. border, where border communities are stretched thin with resources, getting inundated with tens of thousands a week of non-citizens crossing the border from all kinds of different countries, to the impact on taxpayers here in Illinois, states away from the border, because those individuals are being bused to Chicago, and the lack of resources Chicago has to deal with this. And now Chicago's looking to move them to other parts of the state. You have this conversation on how to possibly allow for non-citizens to become members of the U.S. military. But while that's still an idea that's being floated, at least by Senator Dick Durbin and Senator Tammy Duckworth, both from Illinois, you do have a measure that Governor J.B. Pritzker signed earlier this year after it passed the state legislature, allowing certain non-citizens with work permits or who are Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival recipients, also known as DACA, they could become police officers in the state of Illinois. That passed and the governor signed it, and that's seen as an effort, at least from the Fraternal Order of Police, who supported the measure, as did a handful of Republicans in the Illinois House. They saw it as a way to keep recruitment of police officers in the state of Illinois and to gain more police officers in the state of Illinois. So this is an interesting dynamic in the conversation about the non-citizens that continue to come into the country and what kinds of jobs they might be able to get, with some raising concern of allowing for non-citizens to hold jobs that could mean taking away the rights of citizens. Even State Representative Adam Niemerg, a downstate Republican, he said that he's a firm believer that, citizens in the country should be protected by citizens, not by people that are non-citizens. So some interesting developments here. Again, while we hear a lot of the humanitarian issues and the taxpayer costs, you've got these other issues that seem to be popping up from time to time concerning how individuals might find a pathway to citizenship. Is it through joining the U.S. military if a measure passes the U.S. Congress, or is it possibly becoming a police officer if they have a work permit or if they're a DACA recipient? So clearly there's still some contentious thoughts and debates that are being had about this entire issue.
It certainly comes at an interesting time, Greg. The Pentagon announced this week that it missed its recruiting target for the military services by about 40,000 recruits. And Chicago, as we know, has been struggling to hire police officers, along with some other departments across the state and across the nation. So it's certainly an interesting story. Next, I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about the ComEd 4 trial. So there was some breaking news on that this morning. Greg, can you tell us what happened here?
Yeah, so for background, of course, you had former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan in that position for close to 40 years. He was in the State House for 50 years before ultimately retiring, and then facing 22 count indictments alleging that he personally gained from, cooperating with one of the state's largest utilities and getting legislation passed that benefited that utility. And this is, of course, increasing the discussion of ethics and do we have enough ethics in the state of Illinois, especially when you have that kind of power that the former House Speaker had, being not just the Speaker of the House, but also the chair of the Democratic Party of Illinois, controlling the party purse in that nexus that Madigan had. A lot of people had speculation that there was corruption. Now, Madigan faces trial next year in April, and he's pleaded not guilty, but you had several others as part of what the prosecutors called Madigan Enterprise that were not just charged, Brett, but you were in the courtroom for a lot of that in the ComEd 4. They were found guilty earlier this year. So what we have now is when somebody's found guilty, they have to go to sentencing. And you saw that this morning, Thursday, December 14th, when we were recording this for Illinois in Focus, and people can find the story at thecentersquare.com. But you saw the documents that were filed in federal court ahead of sentencing, where the ComEd 4, who are former ComEd officials and lobbyists and people close to former House Speaker Michael Madigan, as part of what prosecutors called Madigan Enterprise, they're asking for their sentencing to be delayed. So you may actually be able to speak to that with even more clarity as to what exactly is it they're looking for.
Well, the defense is arguing at this point to put a stay on everything. So they're saying stay all proceedings, including post-trial motions and sentencing, awaiting a Supreme Court decision, which is expected to come out by June of 2024. So yesterday, the Supreme Court agreed to take up the case of James E. Snyder versus U.S., which the defense attorneys in the ComEd case say could upend those convictions. So they're asking the judge to put a pause on everything, and we'll see how that works out. Now, about a couple of weeks ago, the defense had also asked for more time and also asked to push back those sentencing dates because of other issues, including when pre-sentence reports will be filed. So we've seen them essentially say that they're very concerned about the scheduling of these sentencing hearings and have been, this is now at least the second effort to push back those sentencing. So we'll have to see what happens next in that case. I'm guessing a judge will make a decision before January when those sentencings are scheduled to start for the ComEd 4. who have all been convicted, as you mentioned. But we've got in the mix a former state lawmaker and lobbyist Michael McLean, former ComEd CEO Ann Pramaggiore, former ComEd lobbyist John Hooker, and former contract lobbyist Jay Doherty, who was also head of the City Club. All of them were convicted in May, and all of them are scheduled to be sentenced right now in January. But we'll have to see if that date holds.
So clearly there's a lot more to be said on that case. And Brett, I think a lot of people are looking forward to seeing how all of this plays out when Madigan goes to trial in April. And we saw a lot of evidence come out of the ComEd 4 trial. Undercover video, wiretapped phone conversations. You got to imagine that prosecutors probably have a substantial amount of evidence they're going to provide in courts when Madigan faces trial.
Yeah, I think that remains an interesting question. I'm really looking forward to seeing what they've got. If they'll be leaning on old evidence that's already surfaced in the ComEd 4 trial, or if they'll have new stuff. So I think that's going to be very telling in terms of what they produce at trial next April. But that's not the only legal news we had this week, Greg. Tell us about the latest on the gun front.
So Illinois, of course, in the throes of litigation when it comes to the gun and magazine ban and gun registry that was enacted January 10th of this year. And we're just about less than 2 weeks from the January 1st deadline that people have to register banned firearms with Illinois State Police. And it's been a busy week on the issue of the gun ban registry rules and challenges against those rules and the law itself up and down the federal judiciary. So the most recent news as of Thursday, and I'm looking at the docket entry at the U.S. Supreme Court in Naperville, in the case that came out of Naperville with the National Association for Gun Rights and Robert Beavis versus the city of Naperville and Illinois. This case was actually filed in late 2022 about Naperville's gun ban. But when the state of Illinois enacted a ban on more than 170 semi-automatic firearms and magazines over certain capacities, plaintiffs in this case amended their complaints to include the Illinois ban. So it went to the Northern District Court. The judges there found that the state was likely to succeed on the merits. Then that case got lumped in with a bunch of other cases in the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. This all happening over the span of this year. In the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals 3-judge panel, they ruled in favor of the state. And then you had the plaintiffs out of the Naperville case go to the U.S. Supreme Court asking for an emergency injunction while the case plays out on the merits. And I think this is important for people to understand. The initial movement all year long on the challenges against Illinois' gun ban have been about preliminary motions to enjoin or block the state from enforcing the law while the cases on the merits continue. So all of that we've seen happen in the courts, from the Northern District Courts to the Southern District Courts to the appeals courts and now the U.S. Supreme Court, have all been on these preliminary or initial requests that the law be blocked from being enforced, so that they can then go back and deal with the merits of the case. So today, the U.S. Supreme Court's Justice Amy Coney Barrett, she took the application that the Naperville plaintiffs filed to the U.S. Supreme Court, referred it to the courts, but also denied a writ of injunction. So there's not going to be a preliminary injunction issued by Amy Coney Barrett blocking the state from enforcing that January 1st deadline or enforcing the state's gun and magazine ban. Now, the National Association for Gun Rights, they did post on social media that they do look forward to bringing the case on the merits to the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's where we go down to the Southern District of Illinois, where earlier this week, a motion to block the state's January 1st gun registry deadline, they had oral arguments about that case. So Tuesday afternoon in the Southern District down in East St. Louis, you had the arguments being made, but the judge down there, the district judge, Stephen McGlynn, he told the court, he said that he's inclined to not issue an injunction blocking that January 1st deadline because he says it could make this situation even more messy, using the term messier. And he talked about how that could possibly lead to people pointing to the Southern District and blaming the federal courts for making things confusing. But McGlynn ultimately said, and he has yet to rule, so he said he hasn't made his mind up, but he's inclined to not issue an injunction. He ultimately said that he's looking forward to dealing with this case on the merits. And that's where we're back again. I think all of this is going to fire back up, especially in the district courts with these plaintiffs, because there have been 4 plaintiffs in the Southern District. I want to say there's 3 or 4 different plaintiffs groups in the Northern District. They've been challenging the state law, trying to get those preliminary actions to block enforcement, but they really haven't dealt with the merits of the law. So McGlynn, he says he's looking forward to January and February dealing with the merits, and that's something that could get all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So a lot of moving pieces when it comes to Illinois' gun and magazine ban. But with that January 1st deadline just around the corner, Brett, and we've been tracking this at thecentersquare.com in detail, almost play-by-play, including earlier this week our coverage of the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules, where people can actually go watch that video live, where questions were asked of Illinois State Police. Because the rules that are in place right now for that January 1st deadline, they are an emergency rule basis. And there's a lot of unanswered questions. Now, the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules, a legislative body separate from the judiciary, taking on executive agency rules, they did not take any action on revised rules for that January 1st deadline. Brett, we're 2 weeks away, and they have yet to solidify those rules. There's still emergency rules. There's still tons of questions about what exactly the rules mean for people when they go to register. There's questions about the security of the data that people register when they tell Illinois State Police that they have a banned firearm. There's questions about what kind of attachments. An attachment is an airsoft hand grip, a assault weapon attachment. Does that need to be registered? What about a collapsible stock on a firearm? Does that need to be registered separately? So all these different types of really technical questions still have yet to be fully answered, and the rules have not been finalized. Well, we did ask Governor J.B. Pritzker just moments ago, actually, here in Springfield. He had an event today on Thursday, and a lot of questions about the rules. And the governor said that, he fully anticipates January 1st, the law is going to go into effect, and that's the deadline for people to register. But he doesn't expect people to be charged initially as to, before the rules get finalized. So a lot of this is going to play out while that January 1st deadline comes and goes, with unanswered questions on the finality of those rules, with pending litigation up and down the federal judiciary. We'll be tracking all of this throughout the entirety of the process at thecentersquare.com.
But we've got one more to talk about this week. Will crime impact tourism in Chicago? What's the sentiment?
Yeah, and this is something that, I guess it depends on who you're talking to. And downstate legislator Chris Miller, he raised the issue of being concerned of going to Chicago to visit because of the crime that he hears about and reads about. You see the various accounts of even Governor Pritzker recently saying that, shootings are down and violent crimes down. But when you look at crimes like carjackings and retail theft, those have been up over the past 4 years.
That's it for us today. Thank you, Greg, for your insight into all these important stories, but that's all the time we have. Listeners can keep up with these stories and more at thecentersquare.com. For Greg Bishop, I'm Brett Rowland. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe.